conservative evangelical vote that's decisive in determining the outcome of a presidential election. So in this way, sort of Falwell was a kind of harbinger of things to come. He anticipated this shift within American electoral politics, and he successfully was able to kind of target and mobilize these voters so that not just Falwell had this change of mind, but the broad swath of the evangelical population sort of shared this shift, that the proper work of religion is to be engaged in these sort of public debates, to win in the election box, and thereby sort of help realize sort of the Church's mission in the world. Needless to say, there are some critics about this kind of change, this kind of shift with the successful political mobilization of the religious right, and especially after some people began to sour on George Bush's second term around 2006. You have a lot of prominent people speaking out about the way in which religion was employed as a successful electoral strategy. And the argument here was kind of twofold. One, sort of from just a kind of political perspective, there was a realization that religion is very effective as an election campaign strategy. If one can target religious voters, this is a way of mobilizing support for individual candidates. But when it comes to governing, things are not so easy. Religion is useful for a political campaign, but it might not be as useful, or it might have a whole host of sort of problems when it's employed as a kind of governing strategy. So that's one of the kind of criticisms and the kind of questions people began to ask, especially around the year 2006. But the other is a kind of theological or religious critique. And I've got sort of two figures here that were prominent in that. The first is David Cho, and he wrote a book called Tempting Faith, an inside story of political seduction. David Cho was the deputy director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives from 2001 and 2003. This was an office that was set up kind of early on in Bush's first term as a way of kind of identifying the charitable work that religious groups were doing and actually provide some federal funding, a mechanism for federal funding for the charitable work that religious organizations were engaged in. David Cho was one of the kind of leaders in that new office. But after sort of seeing the kind of pitfalls involved in this, he became very disillusioned and disenfranchised by this process. And so this book was a kind of scathing critique of how not just sort of this idea that religion is useful for political campaigns but not for governing, but more, what effect on the religious integrity of sort of participants does their involvement in politics entail? So this is the subtitle, An Inside Story of Political Seduction. Sort of true believers are being seduced by political power. And once they're seduced by political power, they're compromising their own religious beliefs and their own religious principles, right? By engaging in sort of the messy work of politics, this necessitates compromise, and oftentimes becomes this kind of crass political calculation that doesn't serve the life of faith very well. So this is what David Cho says in 2006. Evangelicals aren't re-examining their political priorities nearly as much as they're re-examining their spiritual priorities. And the notion here is perhaps with this political success comes a loss of the evangelical soul. Or the price of this political success is a loss of their spiritual souls. He chronicles the negative spiritual consequences of political obsession and the limitations of government power. There's only so much government can do, especially if one comes out of a kind of evangelical orientation in which, at least a generation prior, the primary sort of work was supposed to be saving people's souls. And he cites people like C.S. Lewis, who writes, any Christian who uses his faith as a means to political end would corrupt both his faith and the faith writ large. So politics is necessarily corrupting. The power associated, the seductive power of politics, has a corrupting effect on the life of faith. So that's one argument to kind of pull back from this sort of effort that's sort of being involved. And then the second, Gary Wills has a kind of theological critique. He writes a prominent op-ed column in the New York Times along with a book called Christ Among the Partisans. And he says, point blank, there's no such thing as Christian politics. To the extent that the evangelical community has bought into this narrative of the fact that the proper work of the church should be engaged in sort of this electoral success or sort of politics, this is a complete sort of misunderstanding of what the Bible actually teaches. So he's calling for a return to true biblical spirituality and away from this kind of seduction of political power. Okay. At the same time, because Republicans have been successful with this political strategy, you shouldn't be surprised that Democrats begin to realize in order for us to achieve success, we're going to need to be able to peel off some of those evangelical voters in order to win this national campaign. The first book that sort of doesn't talk about this in terms of a kind of political strategy, but just the kind of mistake that so-called liberals have made, is this book called The Culture of Disbelief by Stephen Carter. He's a professor at the law school at Yale University. And he basically says that sort of American legal culture and politics has trivialized religion, and especially sort of progressive liberals sort of don't know what to do with religion. They can't take religion seriously. And anyone who takes religion seriously, they think is necessarily a fanatic. And so this has been a real mistake, especially of Democrats, because while Republicans are courting religious voters and winning electoral success, Democrats are kind of left out in the cold. All right? So there's action-reaction. If Republicans are going to win this way, how are Democrats going to adapt? And really, the person who becomes the kind of leader of this effort is a progressive evangelical, self-styled progressive evangelical pastor named Jim Wallace. He's the leader of Sojourners, which is a progressive evangelical group. And he, during the sort of 2004 and 2008 election cycles, the Sojourners takes out this kind of campaign and newspapers around the country and had bumper stickers, God is not a Republican or a Democrat. So any party which tries to claim that God is on their side, this is an abuse of faith, basically. But at the same time, he becomes the kind of kingmaker in the Democratic Party. He hosts debates in which all Democratic candidates for president have to sort of appear before him. He gives sort of their stamp of approval. Now Democrats are using the language of kind of moral values as a way of sort of talking about their own sort of public policy prescriptions. So this too is an example of this shift I'm talking about from the secular to the post-secular. For a long time, sort of liberals, Democrats, didn't want to talk about religion because they thought religion and politics were supposed to be kept separate. But by the time we get to the 2008 election cycle, Democrats are glad to talk about religion. They're happy for any forum they can have in which they can put their own sort of politics and policy prescriptions in terms of a moral debate. We're committed to social justice. This is a religious, it's a moral value, right? So just as sort of Jerry Falwell sort of undergoes this shift, and it sort of leads to success of the Republican Party, so too the Democratic Party has undergone this shift in recent years. You see this as well in a kind of change in the face of the evangelical community. Jerry Falwell died, but sort of even before that, you have sort of figures like Rick Warren, sort of New York Times sort of best-selling author about the purpose-driven life, who becomes a kind of new key figure, who doesn't want to talk in sort of virulent form about sort of these cultural issues of abortion and gay marriage and things like that. Instead, he tries to sort of broaden the tent of evangelical politics by talking about poverty in Africa and talking about issues of AIDS and social justice and homelessness and inequality. And so it's a kind of broadening of sort of what sort of religious people care about, what sort of issues they care about. Right, so this is all indicative of a shift that's taking place within American politics specifically. Okay, for my final example, spend about 5-10 minutes on this, is what I call the Iranian Revolution Redux. we've got sort of two Iranian revolutions. One in 1979, another one that was sort of thwarted, stopped in its tracks in sort of 2009 over the disputed presidential election, which I'll talk about in a second. And I think if you look at the way in which these two revolutions took shape, this becomes a very powerful example of how you have this shift from the secular to a post-secular mindset within sort of geopolitical affairs as well. Not just something that's happening in the United States. This is something that's happening around the world. And this example of Iran can be sort of broadened out for the whole host of kind of revolutions we've recently seen that are called the Arab Spring, specifically in Tunisia and Egypt. So for 1979, the Iranian Revolution refers to events involving the overthrow of Iran's monarchy under Shah Pahlavi and its replacement with an Islamic republic under the Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the revolution. Public demonstrations against the Shah began in 1977, developing into a campaign of civil resistance that was partly secular and partly religious in 1977. Between August and December of 1978, sort of massive public strikes and demonstrations paralyzed the country. The Shah, sort of the monarch of Iran, left for exile in mid-January of 1979. 2 weeks later, the Ayatollah, the religious leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, returned to Tehran to a greeting of several million Iranians. And you see the kind of massive public support here. Iran voted by national referendum to become an Islamic republic on April 1st, 1979, and to approve a new theocratic constitution whereby Khomeini became the supreme leader of the country. All right, so in 1979, you have an overthrow of the monarchy and the installation by sort of popular vote of a theocratic regime, a religiously ruled political authority. All right, so do away with the secular sort of monarchy and install religious authority as the final political authority. So the moral of this story, for sort of my purposes here, a Western-backed, oil-rich, secular state underwent a revolution to replace its monarch with a theocracy, upending generations of Western geopolitical strategic calculations. For generations, Westerners believed that this kind of modern secular norm was the wave of the future, and Iran was a kind of model for what this was going to look like in the Middle East. After 1979, people realized they had to fundamentally rethink that calculation. A second sort of moral to this story, this revolution was the first shockwave of the potential power of political Islam. Political Islam that we see sort of in radical variants of the war on terror, how this becomes so important since 9/11. And at this point, this form of post-secular political Islam took on a violent anti-Western and anti-American form. To install this sort of theocratic regime meant throwing off the yoke of American influence, repudiating America in all its form. And so the kind of popular sort of incident here of the taking of the American hostages at the U.S. Embassy, the popular displays of sort of burning the American flag on the streets of Tehran. So in 1979, there was a choice, a clear choice, secularism or theocracy. And the Iranian people chose a theocracy, right? Now, so we move on. The Iranian Revolution redux. In June 2009, 30 years later, after the original Iranian Revolution of 1979, that toppled the regime of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, and eventually established Iran as an Islamic republic, the people of Iran again took to the streets with the cries of Allah Akbar, which means God is great, heard from rooftops throughout the city of Tehran. But this time, the revolutionary Islamic rallying cry was not to be heard as rejection of a Western secular political norm and a propped-up authoritarian regime, but a complaint against fraud, a complaint that was inspired at once by the ideals of both democracy and Islam. Despite its uncertain future, what seems evident is that Iran is once again poised on the forefront of a dramatic shift in global politics, and thus serves as an apt illustration of both the post-secular and what I mean by the phrase radical democracy. But to start, I have to once again point out mistakes many